It's time to jump in another Best Ball Mania 4 draft. That's what myself, Colm Kelly, along with Shawn Siegele, are going to be doing on this episode of RotoViz Overtime. If you are playing over at Underdog Fantasy, you can use that code RotoViz, of course, while setting up that account to get yourself a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. Best Ball Mania, Shawn, I did see a note from the Underdog team that Best Ball Mania trees fell the amount of number of people that were able to enter that contest. They would have actually passed that this past weekend. So Best Ball Mania 4, obviously more slots open for people to get in, but it is still moving and filling well up ahead of the season kicking off. So exciting time for the Underdog team, but exciting time for us to also jump in to these drafts. I'm looking forward to getting into it. We've had some preseason action, Shawn. We'll talk about as we move through. Any thoughts on that? But for me, not a lot changes as we go through preseason, especially in week one here. I think we can really emphasis on the small sample sizes that we're seeing. We can see the highlights on social media or on NFL Network, wherever people get their action, where they're checking out the games, and can really overreact. So I think it's better to try and stay a little bit even keel as we move through it here. But Shawn, the listeners are always tuning in. We're always, very appreciative of the community. We love the comments, we love the writtens and reviews, we love all that good stuff. And Shawn, I love drafting with you, but it sounds like you're going to give a lucky OT or Stealing Bananas listener a chance to draft along with Shawn Siegele.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful year. It's been a great week. Obviously, we have those first preseason games. As you mentioned, a lot of really cool stuff happening there. I think the key takeaway, as you mentioned, is don't get too high or too low on the guys. I'll probably have an article out this week, though, kind of making some bold predictions. Last year's article that was in that vein hit on 3 or 4 things that, did come through and matter for fantasy. So we'll look for that a little bit later. But, Colm, we've been doing a lot of Dynasty content on the show, and I do want to mention that part 1 of the big Dynasty article that I've been teasing is now out on the site. Part 2 is written and will be up shortly. And I mean, I wouldn't necessarily expect everyone to agree with this, but this is one of my favorite articles that I've written in a long time. And I do think it will help people see Dynasty in either a new light, or it'll shine some extra light on things that maybe you've been thinking about and you're trying to decide whether or not to go one way or the other. And even if you decide to go the other way, I do think that the arguments that I put forth in this article will be some of the best arguments to push you in the direction I'm suggesting. If they don't convince you, then you definitely want to go the other way, right? And so that is fine too. But I love these couple of pieces. It was just such a exercise in joy to kind of put them together and just love fantasy football. We've had some great guests on talking about the joy of that. Obviously, King Cap was talking about leading into just how much fun it is to play fantasy football. And it's been an absolute blast to draft this RotoViz Trifex League over at the FFPC with Bjorn Yang Barnett, who's got some great Dynasty content up on the site as well. This is such a great time of year. And kind of to make sure that we continue to celebrate that, we recognize this wonderful OT community. I am going to do a draft again with someone from the community. And Colm, last year, the 2 gentlemen that I drafted with, they both were absolutely awesome. The experience was great. We appreciate the different entries that they had into the contest that we ran. And those have been relationships that have continued on. And so I couldn't ask for more than that for year 1. We're going to do it again. And so the way that's going to work, it's going to be specifically about comments for RotoViz Overtime and Stealing Bananas. Obviously, if you leave a comment on both, you kind of double your chances. If you have left us a rating and review in the past, you can leave a new one from a different account. You can update the review that you've left. Simply the act of updating it helps us with the algorithm. So just so appreciative to everyone who's left that in the past. That's what we're going to do for this. And the draft will be a Fantasy Pros $350 league over at the FFPC. The prize for that has doubled this year. So if you were thinking, well, it's not really worth it last year, it's only $500,000. I'm not going to bother to go over and leave a review on my favorite podcast. This year it's $1 million. So we'll be splitting $1 million when we win. 500,000 to me, 500,000 to a listener. Colm, it seems like a pretty good deal. I'm fired up for it. So
it seems like a pretty good deal, Shawn.
Get those in, and it's gonna be so much fun.
I know from the guys that you drafted with last year, they've mentioned to me, and anyone that has got a chance to draft with you over the years, how much it's helped them play, how much they've enjoyed it. And I think that, the draft, a slot alone would be enough then to get to draft with Shawn, and then to have a chance at $1 million. There's a lot on offer there, so highly recommend dropping those written in reviews. We'll be collecting them from this date forward until the contest closes. So today is Monday, the 14th of August. So get them in. As Shawn mentioned, if you have left a written review before, you can go in. I've told people in the past, if you even add a full stop to the end of that review, it will push it back to the top of the algorithm again in terms of where it shows up for the date added. But you can leave an updated review as well if there's anything in there that you want to add. But we really do appreciate that. And as Shawn mentioned, leave one on both shows, double your chances to win. We will announce the winner of that in due time, but make sure you get in and enter as soon as possible. But Shawn, we're going to finish up on Dynasty now. We're going to get into a Best Ball Mania draft. We do promise you to the listeners. But you mentioned the article itself, and we did a show talking about perpetual reloading on using that draft data, kind of the ADP and the moves you made. A lot of positive feedback on last Friday's show talking about that as well. So check out Shawn's articles for sure up on the website. Fantastic stuff. And I know Shawn works hard on everything he puts out, but I know this one is something that he's very proud of. So do head on over, read both of those. I will link them in today's show notes. But also check out last Friday's show if you haven't had a chance to do so already. So Shawn, we're waiting for one more person as we pull up the draft board here for this Underdog Best Ball Mania 4 draft, $25 entry. We are ready to go. We're trying to win that $3 million end of season prize. We want to get that regular season prize. We joked about that when we had King Cap on, but that team is turning out to look better and better as each day rolls around, Shawn. But one spot left. We'll see where we're drafting from then. It is filled. Let's see as the time ticks down here to see where we are. We'll have a little bit of time then to talk through some strategy. And we get, Shawn, tell us what pick we've got here. We have to scroll across.
Yeah, we have the 110.
We have the 110. So depending on how these drafts play out, you can really face the end of a tier break. You could potentially get very fortunate in one of those players that maybe you want to hopefully fall down to at that point. We haven't actually, I think, Shawn, drafted from the 110. We've drafted from the 112 in this at one point, but that's quite a while ago. We have also drafted recently enough from the 1.8 a few times, but the 110 makes it very, very interesting here for us. And it can be a little bit interesting to see what way we play it out. We did a draft recently where I think it was the 108, we went with the Garrett Wilson pick, to try and get him and Waddle, for example, in the second round. Probably feels a little better doing that from the 110, but that might be where we play into in this particular draft. We've seen Wilson's ADP continue to increase up to 13.9. How are you looking at this now as the draft kicks off, and who are you hoping that makes it to us here at the 110? It's an interesting draft slot.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a strong preference. I do think that Amon-Ra is an interesting guy to be mixing in. I like getting a little bit of Bijan Robinson. Haven't selected him in a while, but the 110 does give us an opportunity to get a couple of these star wide receivers. It gives us a chance to set up a draft where we don't have quite as much pressure at QB. One of the things that we've kind of discussed as a low-key important tactical decision is how you are setting up those quarterbacks later. And if you're able to push it and get some ADP value, one of the things that King Cap was mentioning in his drafts was that he was seeing a lot of relatively recreational play. And so even teams where maybe it didn't make sense for them to take a certain quarterback were grabbing those guys. They weren't letting them drop super far. It is one of those elements where there are advantages and disadvantages to drafting with the most experienced players, because you're probably not going to get great values on wide receivers, for example. At the same time, maybe you're going to get some better values on quarterbacks because you're not going to have that element. I've seen it as we get fewer and fewer drafts that are super badge heavy, that we do tend to see those QBs sniped a little bit. Colm, as we go through the first round here, Christian McCaffrey, 105, Diggs, 6, Bijan, 7. We are 3 picks away. We can start to move some guys into the queue. An Austin Eckler, Amon-Ra, Garrett Wilson, CeeDee Lamb. Those are probably the 4 players we would be deciding between right here. Do you have a preference?
Yeah, well, we went with Wilson in that last draft, and I know as we went through it then, I think you were thinking maybe we could have went with Amon-Ross St. Brown there. So I think maybe that's the way we play it. AJ Brown actually goes off the board one pick before, which the dream here would be to land two of these guys or Jaylen Waddle. So Waddle will probably be there. I think we go with St. Brown here, Shawn.
Okay, so we will pass on Austin Eckler, potentially the best running back in fantasy football, the running back on the $2 million team from last season, and a player who fell to the 110. Shawn, so that's a gutsy move.
The 111 he goes at. So that's a real value there for the 111 drafter.
Yeah, we do have a badge there. So not a huge surprise that someone who is probably a little bit more high volume is looking to get some cheap Eckler onto their overall portfolio. Colm, we've watched these kinds of drafts play out a lot, and you do get this dynamic when you come back at the 3-4 where Jahmyr Gibbs is often the best guy. We've talked about him as the next Eckler. I think that Austin Eckler is still going to have a very good season in 2023, but you do manage your risk and also help with some of your structure if you get a couple of wide receivers here, and then you look for the next version of those running backs.
Yeah, so we were one pick away from Garrett Wilson there. He does go with the 2-2. For me here, it's Jaylen Waddle will be the selection for me. The other ones in the mix will be T. Higgins, Devontae Smith. Saquon Barkley's obviously at running back. You were talking through some of the potential options in the next round. I think the way this draft is kicked off in round one, I think it's going to be important to start off with that wide receiver start. I think we could be in. I could be completely wrong here after this round goes through, but it felt like that was a start to a draft that may become quite wide receiver heavy, and with not picking then for the 2 rounds, I think going with Barkley there could make it a little bit challenging when we get back in the following round again. So Wilson there would have been the ideal selection, one pick later, but I still have very high hopes for Jaylen Waddle. And on Wednesday's edition of this podcast this week, we may be going into conversation around Waddle and Hill in particular, and some of these offenses that have wide receivers or pass catchers going in round 1, round 2, and those high value rounds and targeting those. A question that came in from the listener, so that may be on deck for Wednesday's episode. But Shawn, Amon-Ra, Jaylen Waddle, a very, very fun start. I'm finding it hard in drafts that I'm drafting, particularly in the back half. You'd rather be taking that Waddle pick when it's mid-second round into the late second round, but in these drafts that's not just possible. And when you get past CeeDee Lamb, Garrett Wilson, Waddle for me is the next wide receiver, but it's a little bit in terms of where you would prefer to pick them, probably 4 picks ahead. How are you feeling there with Waddle in the early second? I feel like with the players available, it's just the best option available, even though it feels a little bit earlier.
Yeah, well, we talked with Cap about taking Waddle in round 1. I've talked with Eric Hove, who is one of the 2 fellows who did draft with me last season, wrote a really cool article a couple of weeks ago. I've been drafting with him, and he mentioned again that we could go with that Waddle, Mark Andrews 1-2 in FFPC, where obviously the tight ends are going much earlier, and so you'd be looking at Andrews in 2. I've had a number of these drafts with the Waddle injury where he's fallen deep into round 2, and then you can select Mark Andrews with him in round 3. And so without even having to go to that big first round reach to select him, I've been able to build some Waddle Andrews teams. Jaylen has had this issue that he's sat for a few days with, currently with the midsection, where he's constantly dinged up. And yet this particular injury, which has knocked his ADP a little bit in the short term, apparently he's perfectly fine. It's just precautionary. I don't understand where he's going. We've written about him on the site in his first 2 years. And again, you're talking about a rookie and a second-year player, and in many of those cases, actually playing with weak quarterbacks. Now, we had some stretches last year where Tua played well, but then you get the backups. You obviously have the situation the year before. Only 8 guys have outscored him across his first 2 seasons. He's one of the fastest players in the NFL. Teams have to deal with Tyreek Hill. When you talk about the way that we get a move on the trajectory here, if he is the next player who ends up being a superstar, right? That wouldn't surprise anybody. This idea that he couldn't flip with Tyreek Hill, that portion I think is really weirdly priced. Now I have nothing against where Tyreek Hill is going. He also has monster upside in this Miami offense. But if Waddle does get injured, I'm going to be pretty disappointed because I have very few players, especially early, where obviously it's going to be a little more difficult to load up. I have very few players anywhere close to the exposure that I have Jaylen Waddle. I think that he is the easiest pick when we talk about the first half of round 2. I mean, he should be a round 1 guy.
And when we look at this draft and how it's played out, Shawn, I think, my call on how it was going to go in terms of being wide receiver heavy, maybe by the time it comes back to us here, that will play out. But since we picked it, has been Barkley, Adams, Pollard, Olave, Derrick Henry. Calvin Ridley went at the 209, which feels a little bit early, but usually maybe in that third round range. But Taylor, Mahomes, and Hurts go back to back in those last 2 picks of the second round. Then Devontae Smith to the Hurts drafter. We get T. Higgins and Jamar Chase paired up with Patrick Mahomes from that 102 drafter. Since that, then DK Metcalf, Mark Andrews, Josh Allen. Interestingly, Higgins and Smith getting back there in the early third round is really nice for those particular teams. Ramondre Stevenson goes off the board. So we will have some options, Shawn, at some of the wide receivers that we do like here. Amari Cooper, who's not somebody that we're targeting, goes off the board, which is always nice to see. But Samuel, Allen, Breece Hall, Jahmyr Gibbs, who you mentioned, Travis Etienne's there. There's going to be lots of options here for us. Have you any preferred option? Jerry Jeudy can be added in. 2 of these options through the next 2 picks would be ideal. And I think that has a realistic possibility of happening because I know some of these players are filtered based on your rankings, and that's going to mean that they're slightly above ADP in some situations here. Looking with 1 pick remaining, Shawn, Jacobs, who you added to the queue, goes off the board. Then Keenan Allen. Looking at the options available, are you looking at one of the running backs here? Or are you looking at one of the wide receivers?
I think it's hard to pass on the value here in Breece Hall. We do like Debo. We do like Jerry Jeudy. We don't really have the option of going with Keenan Allen and Jerry Jeudy together because Allen goes 1 spot ahead. I think this is probably Breece Hall.
Yeah, we'll go with Breece here. You mentioned the value on Breece Hall. It is 1.5 picks after ADP, but we find it very hard to pass up on Breece. And it was interesting, even with that news, Cook was there. There was no signing. We'll see what happens going forward, but obviously it looks pretty positive for him over the last couple of weeks with that signing not occurring. But I think even if it does happen, if some veteran does come in, I still think that Hall leads the way here quite considerably. And in terms of Hall, Shawn, have you that much ahead of Gibbs and Etienne in terms of where you're trying to rank those guys?
No, I wouldn't. We saw Gibbs look fine in his first preseason game. He supposedly played extremely well in the joint practices. Seamus has a really cool article up on him on the site. I encourage listeners to check that out. We've argued that Gibbs is one of the best picks in all formats for a while. I still think that's true. He probably gives you that close to the same upside with a lot less of the risk given what the injury situation is with Hall there. So I think you can go either way. I do still think that we're going to get a late run with Hall to where his ADP jumps up for the last couple of weeks of drafts, or maybe even it's just the last 10 days where you're drafting pretty heavily. If you can't get him at the good prices during that stretch, then you're going to have wanted to load up right now. Maybe that doesn't turn out to be the case. I think that any shares you get in Breece Hall in the late third, you are absolutely fine. Colm, Jerry Jeudy does go 1 pick ahead of us here. I have Etienne as a possible pick. There aren't really any great receiver values.
I think we go Etienne and pray that JSN gets back to us. I know, in that last selection, I was hoping it was Jerry Jeudy was going to make it to us. I would have took Jeudy over Etienne. When we made that selection, I thought Debo or Jeudy would get back to us. And after that, I would like to take JSN there. But when we look at his ADP, there's a slim chance that he makes it back. It's usually in the mid to late 50s. We'll be picking next at pick 58. So we'll see how that plays out, Shawn. Sometimes it works for you. Sometimes it doesn't work out. How optimistic are you that that's going to work out?
Yeah, no, I think we have a good shot at getting JSN there. Obviously,
and one other thing on that I always like. We talk about players. We talk them up in certain. We talked a lot about Etienne recently. I always want to mention 2 people who are listening in that we are selecting these players as well. So sometimes when it comes to a tiebreaker like that, let's get Etienne. We talked him up last week. Let's get him on the roster here, Shawn, and bring us over the line. I think it's a very dynamic running back group to have Hall and Etienne paired up here on a team. And we have talked in the past about the half point PPR, the necessity to have some of these running backs on the roster, and the potential with the way the landscape is this year to maybe even build a hyper fragile build in a slightly different way, and players we would think would be in those opening 3 rounds, maybe being a little bit later. So I think we're off to a very interesting start here where we can really do whatever we want moving forward. Since that last pick, DJ Moore, Lamar Jackson, Christian Watson, Mike Williams, Drake London, Najee Harris, all being selected. We obviously had a very big highlight play from DJ Moore in preseason. Again, as much as I like DJ Moore, I think we can, proceed with a pinch of salt or a little bit of precaution. We're probably not going to see that on every reception that he has moving forward, but I'm hoping that we see him have a nice season here. Shawn,
I got an immediate update after that game that in drafts that occurred instantly following that, Justin Fields, DJ Moore, these guys are rising. And I mean, you discussed some of the elements that are a little bit humorous there. I mean, we know DJ Moore is good. We know that you can eventually or occasionally
you can do screen passes for 50-yard touchdowns on every play. Like, I think maybe the Bears have really hit on something here. They've done their research over the offseason and they figured out these plays that you can do screen passes for 50 yards on every play.
Well, Colm, I argued in my best pick in each of the first 5 rounds for the FFPC main event that Justin Fields, a quarterback, when even in the new elite QB era, I really still like either window QBs or a combination of window and these late shots where you have this massive breakout or upside. But I argued that Justin Fields is the best pick because he does have these weapons now and he does give you that rushing upside. You're getting the similar or perhaps even a better profile than some of the guys who are going in that second, third round range with Fields. Now, strangely, he hasn't gone yet in this draft as we wrap back into the early 5th. But I don't have a problem with that. I think that he would have been an interesting pick where we took Etienne, and yet it's only an interesting pick if you were on board with that before that preseason game. That shouldn't be the thing that would put you over the top there.
Fields does just go, as you mentioned, that at the 502-2, the Patrick Mahomes drafter. So that team started with Chase, Mahomes, Higgins, and then DeAndre Hopkins paired him up with Fields. And for me, that's a little bit too rich in the quarterback room with those two guys paired in. Obviously, there's huge upside to it, but
the thing I was going to say early was that you look at what these drafters did, and the Jamar Chase drafter at the 211 is looking at it there with Jalen Hurts and Devontae Smith and is saying, I can take Patrick Mahomes because the drafter on the turn is going to go with the 2 Eagles and Higgins will come back to me. That's perfectly set up. I love that for how it worked out for both of them, and yet taking Fields here at the 502 probably does ruin it.
A little bit weird too. Obviously, Joe Burrow does go 2 selections after that, but he could have potentially, I know that he might have a different plan in place, but you could also have both quarterbacks in that Week 17 game, but you could have your 2 wide receivers paired with Joe Burrow as well. So interesting roster building. We are seeing a little bit of a run on quarterback here. We have Joe Burrow, and then 2 picks later again, Herbert goes off the board. So pushing some other options potentially down to us unless we were going quarterback here. That's obviously beneficial. Shawn, I don't want to say it, but JSN is available 2 picks away from us here. Will he make it to us? We have a team that is a 1-1-1-1 build so far with 1 at each position. We also have a team with 3 wide receivers, so could be interesting. But again, we have nice options here. In the queue, we have JSN, Chris Godwin, Kenneth Walker, Kyle Pitts, and Dotson. So again, I've mentioned this a few times. If we get 2 of these guys through these next 2 selections, would be nice. We'll see how it goes. Kenneth Walker goes off the board. Don't take another Seahawks on it. There's one, the team drafting is called Nasty. I don't care. Be nice to us, Nasty. Don't take JSN here, please.
One of the things you can look to do as well, if you take Fields in the range where we are, is that you can come back then in round 6 and probably take Kyle Pitts, who has an ADP of 70. That pick there would be 63. So you can more or less count on putting that together. Now, both of those guys would be above ADP, but both, I think, are undervalued. And so you can look at it from that perspective as well. We talk a lot Colm, about trying to get both ADP values and ranking values. You want to combine those two things. Getting JSN there
I think, Shawn,
was...
I think that is a perfect example of what we're talking about when we do that, waiting on JSN there.
Well, I don't know, waiting on him exactly. We pick him at 58. His ADP is 59. But for us, that is good restraint. Unfortunately, Chris Godwin doesn't come back through. And really everybody that we have in this next range is, overvalued by ADP. Cam Akers, the next player who really sort of stands out from that perspective. Colm, we're going to have to take somebody ahead of ADP. I think our best options are to go with someone like, we can add a J.K. Dobbins. That would be an interesting pick. We can add a George Pickens, a Jahan Dotson, or if we want to go tight end, we can go Kyle Pitts.
Yeah, I think I would be between Pitts and either one of the wide receivers here. I think Pitts for me would be the call based on having the two running backs that we have already. I think it would give us a bit of an edge here.
Okay, so we'll select Pitts to give us that home run play at the tight end position. Again, it's another little stealth way to play the Chicago Bears. If you were very excited by what they did in the preseason, you select Pitts there. It sets you up for Desmond Ridder late, which is nice. We have Amon-Ra, we have Jaylen Waddle, we have JSN. Now you have Kyle Pitts. That gives you 4 interesting upside but inexpensive quarterbacks that you can target with this particular team. I think Dobbins would have been interesting there. You had mentioned the hyper fragile. One of the things I do want to mention, I think people see these really wide receiver heavy drafts and then are a little bit surprised when we don't go as wide receiver heavy as we might have in the past. And part of that is simply that when you're going with the wide receivers column, you actually are trying to get guys who give you this big scoring edge. Players that are just really surprising in terms of how all this is developing. I mean, Amari Cooper in round 3 is absolutely bizarre. You're talking about somebody who has consistently underperformed. Last season, he has a good first 2/3 of the year and then fades. You're drafting a guy at his ceiling to give you floor in the 3rd or 4th round. You look at Mike Williams going in the middle of the 4th. You're drafting someone at his ceiling in order to give you floor. That's not the way a wide receiver heavy draft works. And I'm not saying that I won't be wrong. Even in a situation here where you can look at the profiles of the receivers and it's just very clear cut that they are bad picks in terms of risk reward, that doesn't mean that the guy couldn't hit his ceiling and be a nice selection for you in terms of how it pans out in the end. But when you're drafting a lot of teams, when you're drafting across seasons, you're not going to win with a wide receiver heavy build that is a floor build, that is seeded with a bunch of guys who we know where they are from a talent perspective, and it's not there. I mean, these are not guys who are going to jump into next year's first round. You're just giving yourself so much downside when you approach it that way. It's much better to take some risks, get some upside running backs in that range if wide receiver is flat, come back and get some potential stud receivers later. That's one of the reasons why we have all of these opportunities in 2023. It's one of the things that makes 2023 so much fun is that you have these wide receiver heavy drafts that are being executed incorrectly and opening up a lot of possibilities for drafters who are approaching the season with more flexibility.
Yeah, and I think the point that you're making there is people are drafting, they're not zero RB teams, for example, or hero RB teams, they're wide receiver heavy teams because there's a lot of mistakes being made throughout the rest of the build. And I think that's what's given opportunities. And with the player profiles that are available in those ranges, even you mentioned Dobbins, who is yet to go off the board, would be very interesting if he gets back to us here, Shawn. The other player, the likes of a Breece Hall that we already selected, being able to get those guys at the prices that they are in previous years, we'd be expecting those to be early 2nd round picks, early 3rd round picks, and you're getting multiple round discounts on some of these guys based on where they would have went in the past. So really opens it up for you in this particular half-point PPR format as well. We see some running backs go off the board since we select Cam Akers goes. Then it's Mike Evans, Jordan Addison, Gabe Davis, Darren Waller, Dotson, we've drafted quite a bit of Shawn, Michael Pittman, then Miles Sanders, Damian Pierce, Javonte Williams, Trevor Lawrence, Rashad White. So we are about 6 selections away. We'll see what happens. We did take Pitts there. Pitts is the player that I really wanted at that point. In hindsight, with having the Seahawks and Steelers, facing off in week 17. That may have been interesting there as well for us as a potential option. And Dobbins would have given us the bring back for the Dolphins game as well. So a couple of ones there that in hindsight, as Dobbins goes off the board, I may feel a little bit different about. Quentin Johnson would have been in the conversation as well for a Shawn. But I still like the Pitts pick, but George Pickens goes now. I still like the Pitts pick. I'm going to keep telling myself that. In hindsight, Shawn, would Pitts still have been the selection for you there? Some of the targets that we would have had, and Dotson, Pickens, and also Dobbins all off the board.
Yeah, I think that selection is perfectly fine. The element that we're looking at there is that Pickens is not going to come back, but I mean, you're reluctant to take him probably that far ahead of ADP, but he's the guy I would reach for. I've mentioned that JSN is a good pick earlier in round 5, specifically because you're going to get Pickens in this range, like the 7-7, and mostly I think you're going to get him in the 7-2, 7-3 range, as opposed to coming all the way back to you. So if you don't come all the way back, then I mean, you kind of prefer having those two guys together. The co-eruption, especially as it works in week 17, I think is nice. Colm, what do you think about taking Zay Flowers here and putting him with Jaylen Waddle?
Yeah, that works for this build. Yeah, I'm good with that. And with the tiebreaker of the week 17, I'm interested here to see if it happens with, we talked about overreactions in preseason, for example. Somebody who's a few picks past ADP here who's DeAndre Swift, but another player who may, Shawn, potentially get back to us in the next round, but I don't think he will in this particular draft, would be Tua if we wanted to pair him with Jaylen Waddle. We can also push it a quarterback, and we were talking about earlier, some of the cheaper options would be in the mix for us as well. But are you feeling, you're usually the one that'll, let us push the quarterback that little bit further down the road, but is Tua one that you're willing to make that exception for when you have one of those Dolphins receivers?
I think that the tricky one here is always if you're going to take a Brandon Cooks to go with an Amon-Ra, and he does go.
Talk through the process anyway.
Well, one of the things here is that there's been a lot of negative press on Tua in the last 3, 4, 5 days. And so there's a chance that he would actually come all the way back because the Tyreek Hill drafter has selected Joe Burrow. And so you have that element as well. Now, I mentioned, are we seeing as much of that now? No, we're seeing drafters tend to go ahead and take the ADP value on a guy, even if it doesn't make as much sense for their build. I think that this is Tua versus Elijah Moore.
Any consideration for Treylon Burks?
I don't think so with the strength that we have sort of at wide receiver. It's not unreal, but we have 4 guys. We have the 2 rookie potential breakout candidates. This is a nicely balanced squad here with 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 4 receivers, 1 tight end. It gives us a lot of flexibility as we move forward. I do still think that what you're going to want with Jaylen Waddle is that Tua selection. And I've argued in a variety of places that Tua is basically giving you a round 5, maybe a 5-6 turn quarterback in round 8. The Tyreek Hill drafter, I think, has a lot of great opportunities over the next week and a half because of how things have transpired in terms of the joint practices, the preseason game, what have you. I think that the Waddle drafter is going to pass a little bit more often. The Tyreek Hill drafter is going to get that opportunity, not just with Tua getting past Waddle, but being able to let him wrap around the turn. That's something I think that you should really look at. I would have liked us to take Brandon Cooks right there, but he didn't make it the last couple spots.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. We were being given a few options there for stacking up some of these games. And again, you don't want to overemphasize week 17 because you want to get there, but it's also part of the kind of mix if you can make it work at those particular prices. Treylon Burks, who I mentioned, does go a couple of picks later. We do take Tua. Also, Shawn, that Flowers, now it's 3 players paired together in that week 17 game with Zay Flowers, Tua, and Waddle. But you were talking about, the price. That's pick 87, the 803 that we take him at. When we look at certain players, we've talked about injury discounts at the running back position, for example, which I think is part of the Breece Hall conundrum at the moment. But Tua, if we just take when he was healthy and played last year, this offense was electric and he looked really good. And we had those same concerns heading into last season. There was the clips on social media from their own social media team, I may add, with the wobbly balls and struggling with that deep throw. And it turns out that Tyreek Hill is just so fast that you can underthrow him and he can still catch it for a deep touchdown. That just seems to be the way it goes with him. So we have Tua there now added. And pretty exciting start to this, Shawn. We'll see how we play out here as we move forward, but we can really move this team in any approach. The one question I have for you is, we have talked on this about the possibilities of going later with tight end. We've talked about different ways to play the position and the options that are available late. When it comes back to us here at this next selection, there's likely to be, maybe a Greg Dulcich there, a few other options. Is there any itch for you to really go two tight end build here and use the other positions then to fill it out?
I think if you go with Freiermuth here, it gets
another option, yeah,
because then you get the Steeler opposite. I think that's a fun way to play it. Otherwise, I don't know that we have a lot of incentive once you get Kyle Pitts there. Another player who would have been interesting would be Rashad Bateman. If he had made it back, you can continue to stack up that Ravens-Dolphins game, specifically because you like the guys individually, right? And you're going to get players who are individually undervalued, and then you can put them in this group together. Once Bateman goes off the board, though, we see a huge gap here where wide receivers are not the value for a long time. I think Brian Robinson is maybe the other interesting guy in this range. He goes one pick ahead of us. So, Colm, that leaves us with Freiermuth, which I think is a pretty straightforward selection with JSN already on board.
I think this fits really well, and I think it's something a little bit different than we have done so far with any of these builds, so I think it'll set it up to be pretty fun. I usually ask you the question, Shawn, does that make it a two tight end build? I won't do that because there's going to be some tempting options here as we move through the draft, but you've just added him to the queue, and that would be my probably way to play this next pick when we're looking at the running back options. That is Devin Etienne. I think could be interesting again to fill into the Tua side of things. We talked on a recent draft. I can't remember, Shawn, if we took them together or if it was something that I just mentioned, but the possibility of him getting work out of the backfield as well, and that also working out on those short dump offs, for example, from Tua. And you're kind of covering this offense then from every single angle. You have the quarterback, you have outside of Tyreek Hill, you pretty have the majority of ways we're thinking this offense is going to run. So one pick away, it would be 4 picks ahead of ADP. The drafter selecting has already 5 running backs. He goes with Njoku. How do you feel, Shawn, about adding the Miami Dolphins running back here to this roster?
It gives us a lot of upside. I don't know if I have so much A-chain at this point that I'm starting to get a little tempted to go back in the other direction and get a little bit of Mostert, get a little bit of Wilson. The other player who is interesting here would be Geno, now that we have the tight end opposite. Geno or A-chain?
A-chain for me.
Okay. So we will stick and take another running back to get the running back and firepower up. That gives us guys with 3 different buys. Not a huge consideration, but does give you more flexibility as you go forward. And again, we are making a bet on this Dolphins team that looks undervalued.
Yeah, I think so. And just for people listening, I've been getting a lot of comments on YouTube or people DMing me that, Shawn is drafting running backs and, I won't draft any running backs. I have pushed to draft a running back there. It was over a quarterback, but I have made the push. Shawn, I love the way this team's setting up. I think it's one of my favorite drafts through these opening 10 selections so far. How are you feeling about it at this point? I know we could have went there. We could have a 2 quarterback, 2 tight end build through this particular point, but the way this is set up, I think we're pretty loaded in all facets of the team here.
Yeah, when you start that wide receiver, it does give you more pathways that you can pursue from that point. Now, it shouldn't make you overconfident. It's easy to start wide receiver, and then end up still light at the position. I think that as we get more news from training camp, that we're starting to get a little bit of a spark from this guy here or that guy there, to where you feel more comfortable layering them into some of your teams late. Now, some of it can end up being very misleading. I mean, you think about guys from the Kansas City Chiefs, for example, who are playing well. You have a Rashee Rice. You have a Justin Ross.
Richie James.
You have James. Those guys consistently playing well, and yet in terms of where they actually are in the pecking order, it seems still behind players we know aren't interesting from fantasy, like an MVS, like a Justin Watson. I mean, Watson's someone who, again, a perfectly fine reality role player. You think about someone like a Jalen Hyatt, and then you watch this Giants preseason game and Colm, there's nothing more demoralizing than watching a preseason game where Cole Beasley is catching all of the passes, and you're thinking, okay, well, we've gotten buzz for Hyatt. We know that Wan'Dale Robinson is going to come back and be an impact player. You got to like an Isaiah Hodgins. Paris Campbell has supposedly lit the world on fire. You know that Darren Waller is in there having a great training camp. To come out and feature Cole Beasley, I think that on the one hand, it does remind you that skepticism about all of the training camp buzz is important. On the other hand, it also reminds you that these preseason games, the teams are not showing you what they're going to do, right? When you look at the situation currently with the Dolphins, it's like they're pretty obviously playing possum. You're telling me that Mike McDaniel has come out of a full offseason prepare and doesn't have solutions for some of these things? I mean, no, he's just not showing you what the solutions are right now, because that wouldn't be to their advantage. When the Giants come out and feature Cole Beasley,
there's no advantage to blowing out teams in preseason.
Well, certainly not much of one, and it's not going to carry over points-wise to the regular season. You do want your team to be ready. Some of these teams who take it to an extreme and then get off to a bad first half in week one, there are only 17 games, right? Your guys are going to get hurt, and some of them you may not be 100%. When you can win, you need to do that. The team who is ready to go out there and get off to a 2-0 start, I mean, that team is much more likely to make the playoffs. So I think there's some risk to not doing anything and not showing anything early. But yet, I mean, we shouldn't take a Cole Beasley as an example of someone, number one, that we should draft, and then number two, that the rest of these guys are dead. But we do have to think through all of the buzz that we're seeing as well. My big picture point, though, is that there are some situations now where late wide receivers become a little bit more viable. And so a wide receiver start is going to give you flexibility to maybe take an elite quarterback, to maybe take an elite tight end, to maybe plug in a couple of running backs you really like. Probably not all of those things on the same roster, but it does give you some flexibility overall.
So, Shawn, we are 2 selections away. Again, Geno Smith did go with the 11:04. I was looking to see, who needed quarterbacks, but there was a couple of teams there with one quarterback. They do add the second one. We will have still options, though, as we move forward here with the way this team is setting up. On the clock now, Goff, Shawn, was one of those options for us. It does go. We are picking at 1:30. Elijah Mitchell will be an option. Jaylen Warren will be an option. I'm feeling a little bit like Rondale Moore. Any interest, Shawn, in Jacoby Myers?
I've picked Myers quite a bit. I think this might be a good spot for the running back from this team that we're featuring. I do think that Rondale will come back around, and he would be my preference at that turn there. I definitely add Jacoby Myers to the queue. He would be a good fallback. I don't think both of those receivers are going to go in the interim. One of the things here, and maybe just to tap the brakes a tiny bit on our Jaylen Warren enthusiasm, this is a back who averaged less than 5 yards per carry at Oklahoma State. It's a back who is both small and has terrible measurables, not athletic at all. And I'm not saying that you should take that and say, oh, what he did last year and what he's doing in training camp, that doesn't matter. Let's only focus on the college stuff. That's not the point. The point is just making sure that we're calibrating our expectations a little bit and remembering that so much of what we're seeing with Jaylen Warren is merely the contrast with Najee Harris, who probably not a starting caliber running back in the same way that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is not a starting caliber running back. So we tap the brakes a little bit, and yet when it makes sense, we go ahead and make that selection column. Rondale does come back here. Anybody else you want to consider?
No, it's really between him and Rice, and I think it's, for me, still clear to go with the Rondale route on this particular one. Interesting there, Shawn. We did talk at the last pick, and we did take Pat Fairmouth, fitted really for the build to get the Steelers in with the Seahawks. We've taken another Steeler since there, as you mentioned, at running back in Warren. But all the way to that last selection, we did have the option. We would have had the option there of Greg Dulcich, who would have been very interesting, who I would have been open to taking at the last pick. So I think at the 10:02 is a a nice spot to get him there as well to add into the roster. So far we have Amon-Ra, Jaylen Waddle, Breece Hall, Travis Etienne on this particular roster, paired with Jackson Smith and Jigba, Kyle Pitts, Zay Flowers. Then we have Tua, Pat Freiermuth, Devin Etienne, Jaylen Warren, and Rondale Moore. All those running backs, Shawn, it's something that really doesn't matter in the bigger picture. All have different bye weeks. It just means that we're not tracking across the same. But are you looking here at 4 running backs, or do you still want to go for a 5th or a 6th?
I'm not too worried about exactly where we get from the running back position at this point yet in the draft. I think you have plenty of flexibility when you take those first 2 guys. It can be 5, it can be 6. If you have a best player available and you feel comfortable with your other selections, it can be more than that. The thing that is kind of interesting here, and it's not necessarily to criticize individual drafters, and it's not to say that it couldn't work, because one of the things that we have mentioned is that the stacking element probably is a little bit overstated. You look at the Stack Explorer prior to this past season, and you think about how the stack stuff was especially amplifying in both directions in 2022 because the QB injury rate was so extremely high. And at the same point, when you're thinking about what it means in a best ball tournament and how you're going to, number one, make it through, and then number 2, how you're going to win a title, it is interesting in this particular draft where you have a Geno Smith selected by someone who doesn't have either Seahawks or Steelers on their team. You have Jared Goff get within 1 pick of us, and I would have argued to go ahead and take Goff, even though usually with Goff, I like to have the full game stack set up as opposed to just on one side of it. But you have someone select Goff who doesn't have players on either of those teams. And so those are probably picks that don't really work. And you're looking at some mild ADP values. There is an ADP value on Smith in this draft. Jared Goff is not a value. It's just right at ADP. There are other ways that you want to do that. And I'm probably some listeners and some drafters are thinking, well, we'll just backstack some of these guys. That's not a very effective way to play this. You don't have control of it. You're going to be putting your quarterback with players who aren't as good. That part doesn't give you nearly as much advantage. I mentioned Bjorn earlier in the show in relation to his great dynasty stuff. He's got some really cool best ball stuff looking at that element of it, these late and back stacks. So something to think about, but also this dynamic we discussed earlier in draft season where you can push some of these guys at QB. Again, that is running into some more trouble right now. Fortunately for us, we do have some other ways that we can still play this. We have the Pickett selection always set up, which I really like, especially when you have a quality number 1 in Tua. And as you mentioned, when you have Freiermuth here set up with a JSN, and then again, you can always take a Desmond Ridder at the very end. Now with Rondale Moore, you also have that possibility to take a Kyler Murray if you really end up liking that play. So as we get here to the 154, Kendre Miller is an ADP value, but has hurt himself again. You have Roschon Johnson and that dynamism that we're seeing, or at least people are now feeling in the Bears offense. Any direction that you are leaning here?
Too early for Hyatt?
Probably too early for Hyatt.
What about Kyler? How do you feel about that?
Let's go ahead and make that click add him into this particular.
I think it's when we've been in that discussion point quite a few times before, it's been that we haven't taken a quarterback at this point. So to pair him with Tua, you would hope that that's going to get him through those early portions of the season to be healthy. I think it's, in the 13-10 here, I think it's very, very interesting. I know you're adding Pickett now to the queue, but how do you feel about, have you those concerns with Kyler that he's not going to play this season? That he, if it's a case that he's out for 6 weeks and the team is 0-6, for example, that they may not continue to want to push this team this season? Would you be looking to add that third quarterback?
I don't think that you can do that. I don't think as an organization you can put your coach and your new GM into this dynamic where they're going to look so bad in the first season. They also need to see how that offense is going to run with Kyler. Everything that I'm hearing is about whether or not he's going to play in week 1, which he's not going to. But that gives you a sense of where we are in terms of his trajectory and the fact that you'd be discussing that. So week 5, week 6, yeah, they're not going to have a good record at that point, but they're going to come out and they're going to try and put some points up. We've made the decision with Rondale Moore. I think you have to lean into it there with the Kyler pick.
That's what I was hoping to hear. I'm hoping for it to settle on 2 quarterbacks. Pickett did go off 1 pick before this. Shawn, we do go with another additional running back. It's interesting there. Miller, quite a big discount, almost 20 picks after ADP. We do go with Roschon Johnson. That there is one where when we talk about, preseason and how things are affected is injury news and how that can affect players' ability to be ready for the season, and also potential recurrence of it. Now, high ankle sprains, depending if you're fully healthy when you come back, on less likely to be re-aggravated, but that is something that sometimes we see people come back a little bit too soon from, rather than muscular injuries, which we do see recur quite often. But Miller is out. The other benefit to being out at this point is that you're going to be healthy for week 1. You're not going to get injured worse in the rest of preseason. But with a rookie coming in, you want to see them get some of those snaps, get familiar with the offense, and he goes 2 picks after us at the 14:05, which I would have been tempted. Shawn, how did you feel about Johnson versus Miller there?
It's just very dispiriting because Miller is one of my highest rostered players. I do think that he's a bigger talent than people are giving him credit for. I think that he might be the 3rd best back in this class. I think he was set up very nicely, but the injuries now have caused a problem. We know that even before the injuries, they had, this inkling that maybe they might want to sign another back. You are going to be dealing with a Jamal Williams, which also the additional people they're looking at are terrible news for that Jamal Williams signing. I think if you are racing to get back for week 1, and then you are going to get squashed by Alvin Kamara once he comes back, then it's a problem. Now, I think that Miller is good enough, and I think that they're invested enough in him from a big picture perspective that it still wouldn't surprise me at all if the move pays off. I think that we just need to tap the brakes a little bit right now. If you're in the case or in the situation that I'm in, where you have a lot, it's not the time to add more. That doesn't mean that it couldn't work out. Colm, the other thing that is interesting there, we have a drafter right next to us who across rounds 12, 13, and 14 did take 3 QBs. They go Russell Wilson, Brock Purdy, Kenny Pickett. In each of those cases, they have one guy from that unit. I think when you're looking at Pickett, one of the reasons why I was willing to pay or pull the trigger on Kyler Murray where we did is that Pickett becomes a little bit tricky right now, especially when you have the tight end, because you know that both of the drafters at the wide receiver position are going to probably be looking at him at least a little bit. You have the Deontay Johnson drafter who does grab him here. You have the George Pickens drafter who has Pickens just ahead of where we have Freiermuth. And so we're kind of blocked both directions. For me on Pickett, it wouldn't have been the 159 where we would have looked at him. It would have been the 178, which is a little bit after ADP. I would have been willing to risk that the Pickens drafter passes on him twice, but the player who actually takes Kenny Pickett is looking at that and saying, he's not going to come back to me past both of these players, so I'm going to have to draft him at 158. That's something that you have to consider with Pickett, especially now that there is at least some mildly positive buzz about their passing game.
Yeah, and I think we might have seen that as well with the Goff pick was 1 pick before ours. Drafter may have looked and seen that we had Amon-Ra St. Brown and thought he's not getting back to us potentially because we had no quarterback at that particular point in the draft. Interesting, Shawn, that drafter was the only drafter at that point with no quarterbacks, and they really piled on to get 3 of them in there. So it'll be interesting to see when it's over how that roster plays out. We're 1 selection away here, Shawn. The pick I would have potentially pushed for the last selection was Curtis Samuel. We didn't go that way. We went and got our quarterback. How do you feel about Samuel here right at ADP?
I like it. I would kind of like to also get a Zamir White, given the situation there with Jacobs. We've taken 3 young running backs behind Hall and Etienne. The upside there, I think, pretty significant. I do think when you have Pitts and Freiermuth, you are set for a potential 2 tight end build. Some drafters are probably going to think this is a little bit risky, but I think when you have Tua, you don't have that buy until week 10, that you could probably go with just the 2 quarterbacks. But also we're now into a position where the 3rd quarterback we'd probably be looking at would be Desmond Ridder in the 17th or 18th round, which really frees us up to do some other things. Now that we've added Curtis Samuel, you could always take a Sam Howell. He had a good, not great first preseason game there. Obviously throws the touchdown to Jahan Dotson. Colm, you have some other guys here. One of the things with Justin Ross, I think he's an interesting selection at this point, but also we want to be a little bit careful of not going overboard.
Yeah, so there's that balance. The most attractive draft pick here, Shawn, is Justin Ross. That's based on what's happening at the moment, or hype wise, for example. I think White is a very interesting pick here. So we are on the clock. I think, Shawn, we're at a 2 quarterback, 2 tight end build. I think that gives us the ability to add another running back here if we want.
Okay, so we will grab White. We have 2 picks remaining.
We haven't, and that's the other thing, Shawn. We haven't done a draft really together where we had been doing quite a few where we're waiting on quarterback, waiting on tight end. We're doing, adding 3 to 4 tight ends at the end, getting 3 quarterbacks towards the end. So that's 6 to 7 selections. But if you end up in a team here where we go 2 and 2, that is freeing up from those other previous drafts. It's giving you an additional 2 selections, so you can go with the running back and the wide receiver positions, but you can also let it play out and see what happens here at tight end, because in the queue at the moment, we have Justin Ross, who Shawn mentioned a moment ago, and it was very tempting to go with that pick, but we have drafted him quite a bit. Hopefully, I think there's no chance he gets back to us with the preseason hype, Shawn, but and he is already past ADP by 7 picks, which is interesting. But Wendell Robinson, Chase Claypool, Michael Wilson to go back in with the Arizona Cardinals as an option, Hunter Henry, Trey McBride. And as we are, I think, Shawn, we are, as a show, we are contractually obligated to add Sam Howell and Desmond Ridder to the queue. So that has also been achieved.
When we look at this and some of the elements that we can try and play here, Chase Claypool would go opposite Kyle Pitts. Obviously, Michael Wilson, as you mentioned, would lean into the Arizona Cardinals element of it, but as would Trey McBride, who would give us that 3rd tight end and round that portion of the team out a little bit. There's no pressure to do so, but we can. Obviously, Howell and Ridder do have players who are on this team, and so if we get wiped out of the other guys that we consider to be priority types of players, those would be the picks who would be consolation picks at the end and still make a lot of sense for this roster.
Yeah, probably add Terrence Marshall to the queue as well when we're down this deep and we're looking through. Any other very late round wide receiver names that we're scrolling down past here that are of interest to you this season? It gets completely dead really once you go past. Maybe Puka is a player that obviously is getting some preseason buzz as well, but gets very, very deep waters here once you get into the 200s.
Yeah, I think that Josh Downs is maybe more interesting than I've given him credit for a lot of the season. His yards per route, his yards per team attempt in his final year there with Sam Howell in 2021 was absolutely fantastic. He brings this elite run after the catch element. He's got good explosiveness and testing. His issue is that he is an underneath receiver and he is very small. We know that if Anthony Richardson wins the starting job and keeps it for a decent stretch of time, that's a little bit tricky because his issue in college was apocalyptically bad short area accuracy. He could make a jump there. There's a possibility they could use Downs in a little bit different way. The tricky part for the Colts is how do they manage the strengths and weaknesses for Richardson? Because we know that he can throw a deep ball. I mean, he's got incredible athleticism, and that comes with amazing arm strength. But you throw too many of those passes, and you're facing a lot of difficult down and distance situations when, maybe until they get Jonathan Taylor fully healthy, you have some issues there. That offense and what they decide to do tactically is going to be really interesting. One of the things holding Downs down right now is he's playing behind Isaiah McKenzie, but you listen to the people following the Colts, and they think that Downs grabbing that job, especially as there have been some high-profile misses of Richardson to McKenzie recently, they think it's only a matter of time. I think it's only a matter of time until Downs is almost like a 1B to the 1A of Michael Pittman.
Okay, so we're back on the clock. We have 2 selections left, Shawn. Feels to me like we could go, and Sam Howell's gone, but we probably could round this out with 2 wide receivers. There is the option to go with Trey McBride and another wide receiver. But how are you feeling here? 12 seconds to go. We'll make the first pick. Probably should be a wide receiver unless we go with McBride.
I think Wandale is easily the best guy here. Any reason not to go that way?
No, that's okay. The only reason I would have given, we had 1 second left when that question was asked, would be the Claypool pick, just based on ADP, but he should probably still get back to us here. Famous last words and 3 selections from now. Do you feel any pull to go with Desmond Ridder or Trey McBride over a wide receiver here?
Well, we're up to 7 at receiver, which I think is fine. We don't want to push it if there's a clearly better pick. I don't know with Pitts and Freiermuth that we need a tight end, and yet McBride kind of gives us that guy who is a year ahead of where Wilson is. Now, Wilson did start in the preseason game, partly because Marquise Brown not playing in that game. Yeah, you have signs pointing in multiple directions here. We're going to discuss it on the next show. Michael Wilson was not a good college player. That's always a red flag, especially when someone's getting pushed up on buzz of, mostly trying to say that maybe the other guys there aren't good. We've made the bet on Rondell Moore. It might be interesting to make the bet on Trey McBride.
Yeah, let's do it. I think I would rather go with McBride, even though we already have the 2 tight ends. I guess we can say I'm a Trey McBride stan at this point. But I think because we only took the 2 quarterbacks, we were able to build up the wide receiver and running back positions sufficiently. So it's a 2-6-7-3 build. Quarterback, it is to Kyler Murray. Then we have Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, Devin Etienne, Jaylen Warren, Roschon Johnson, Zamir White. I think that's a pretty loaded running back room that we have assembled. Then it's Amon-Ra, Jaylen Waddle, JSN, Zay Flowers, Rondell Moore, Curtis Samuel, Wendell Robinson, and then it's Kyle Pitts, Freiermuth, and Trey McBride. Shawn, I have to say I'm pretty, sometimes after the draft, and you mentioned you don't want to get too confident with some of your selections, but there's times after the draft where I need to let it settle in. We need to talk through it to see how I feel about it. This might be one that you have to talk me out of my excitement post-draft. How are you feeling about it?
It's a really cool team. Because you look at it and you're able to accomplish all of your objectives. The players that you want to both be very excited about and have a lot of exposure to, and then if you get opportunities to go in a different direction, you want to take it because you don't want that exposure to get too crazy. When we think back to last year and Breece Hall, our highest roster guy, and it was going to be a hit, and then he gets hurt.
Yeah.
Which crushes you. So you're going to balance some of those things. But the 2 guys who really do that for you are Kyle Pitts and Tua Tagovailoa, because they should just be going much, much, much earlier. Or at the very least, it's easy to see a scenario where they dramatically outperform their ADPs. We're looking at 2023, and the challenge is how do you work in some of these great running back values and still get the wide receiver firepower you need? Well, one of the ways that you do that is by waiting until at least round 6 to take either a tight end or a quarterback. Those 2 players unlock so much because their upside in a tournament environment matches players who are drafted so much earlier. I think you can make that same general case at the running back position where Breece Hall and Travis Etienne also give you that. Ben and I are going to do our 2024 first and second round show. The show that we do every season where we forecast the future. Well, it's a fun one. And
one of my favorites.
We've hit on a lot of the guys who jump into those rounds and a lot of the guys who fall back out. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to see the future and make the perfect picks every season, or you're going to have the right mix on individual rosters. Going into the year that you don't win every single league that you play. But that mindset is extremely valuable in terms of, again, putting yourself in a position to have the right mix of talent profiles, the right mix of risk profiles, and then you put that within the right structure and how it elevates the type of structure that is also going to be dominant because of what we know from the roster construction explorers, past history, past experience playing, all of those types of things. So when you look at that with an Amon-Ra and a Jaylen Waddle, you get those 2 running backs, both running backs who, they're both probably top 5 talents at the running back position. You get them at this spot. It's really a gift that you want to not look too hard at and not give away in too many drafts. One of the things that kind of stunned me recently when I put out the Travis Etienne article, and we had the full show on how Not that he's going to be the next Jamal Charles. Jamal Charles is probably the best running back to ever play. You wouldn't put that on anyone, but echoes of Charles in terms of what he does, what he brings to the table. Both you look at college, you look at what he did last year. For Travis Etienne to be going at 403 is mind-boggling. And again,
that's one though that on social media at the minute with preseason, that backfield it's a hot topic. You know, there's a lot of
Colm, I'm wrong about stuff all the time, and we talk about that I'm going to be wrong. I've been wrong in the past. I'm going to be wrong in the future. There is a massive gulf in talent between Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby. A massive gulf.
But his name's Tanks Bigsby.
Well, Tank,
he's got that name. Like
he's a little guy. I mean, not little by normal human standards.
How many rounds of ADP bump do you give for having a cool name?
Well, Travis Etienne has a cool name. We should try and push him up a little bit. No, I mean, if Bigsby and Charbonnet have good seasons, and it's not outside the realm of possibility at all that they would do so, because their coaching staffs obviously like them, and those offenses look like they will be dynamic. Those two players are perfectly set up for so much of what we like in a zero RB play. The issue is just when you look at the other side of it, Kenneth Walker and Travis Etienne are incredible players who have this size production background that is very unique. And so one of the things that we talk about on the show constantly, and I think needs to be a constant refrain, is that talent matters and giving people credit for what they have done matters. That's one of the reasons that we're a little bit down on Anthony Richardson. It doesn't mean that he couldn't have a huge season, but Anthony Richardson was not a good college player. And so he's looking to make this jump from bad to good at the NFL level where it's difficult to do. Not impossible. And if you've got great intangibles, if you have great athleticism, if you have great coaching, and I think that you could argue that those things are in place, certainly if you could pick any team in the entire NFL for Anthony Richardson, it would be the Indianapolis Colts. But when we talk about having an evidence-based perspective and an evidence-based background when we're looking at how we want to conduct drafts, one of the things that you're not trying to do is take someone and say they're going to be a different player than they were in the past. And I think that some listeners are going to be like, well, why do you guys draft rookies so early? Why do you draft these unproven players so early? And one of the reasons is simply that you don't have to have done it at the NFL level to be easily projectable to do it at the NFL level. If you're a great athlete who dominated your competition all the way along, history shows us, and Blair has all kinds of great articles. If you're interested in the age trajectory element of it, it's one of the things that even back in 2013 that John Moore, the fantasy douche, Matthew Friedman, and I were working on a ton. It has become more or less accepted, but even then it can be easy to accept it and not understand the magnitude of the impact. Blair Andrews has a lot of great articles on the site looking at these age trajectory elements, but people tend to think about that over the course of a player's entire career and miss the fact that it's really mostly relevant in years 1 and 2. And then once you get to that, 29, 30, 31, 32 range, the rest of it is like, yeah, the player is who they are. And you want to draft them as who they are, which is one of the reasons why when a receiver who is kind of in that 20 to 40 range has a good year, you don't overdraft them the next season. You always draft the players who are established and have locked themselves into being a certain guy whenever they're punished. And one of the players that we're not drafting, but is kind of interesting because he has such a track record of outperforming ADP, is a Tyler Lockett, right? Deontay Johnson underperformed last year, but has a history of outperforming. You draft these guys who are being punished, like a Deontay Johnson. Why did we pass on him when we selected there? I think you get locked into JSN and you're thinking, okay, we're going to make that selection. And then Deontay Johnson is the person that you pass on at the 5'10". That part of it probably doesn't make a ton of sense. There are guys who are pretty clear values and guys who are obvious misses when you look at that 3 through 5 range, just based on the fact that they've established who they are. And any given year, you draft the ones who are inexpensive and you fade the ones who are expensive because you can't win by chasing the guys who, again, are established as a certain thing. You can't chase them up. That will never win for you. where understanding the magnitude of the effect in terms of production related to age and experience, where that really matters is when the guy comes into the NFL, when he goes into his second year. It's one of the reasons why we have a lot of exposure to those players, but they're specific players. They're players who outperformed relative to the competition at the right ages going through. That's where you get the big advantage. So that would be kind of the thing that I say here. Zay Flowers, someone we drafted because he kind of fits this build. He's actually a guy where there are some red flags. I mentioned Josh Downs as a potential late pick. Both of these guys are in situations where a running QB with potentially limited accuracy. I mean, one of the things, as I wrote that Dynasty article and looking at the first round where people are being drafted, is that the accuracy numbers for Lamar Jackson, we gets so focused on the fact that he wasn't healthy the last couple of years, which is very troubling. And yet he was also extremely inaccurate when he played. Is that going to be a great fit for Flowers? Statistically, there's an argument that Zay Flowers is actually a poor man's Josh Downs. And again, when you're trying to think of like, how do I beat ADP in all of these different formats? Well, you would take the better profile that's discounted by a lot of rounds, right? Now, they went in different spots of the reality draft, which is going to lock them into different volume situations early. You also want to take that into consideration. We know what the teams who drafted these players, we know what they think. And certainly for Downs, I mean, he's just really knocked by the overall situation there. But those would be the things that we kind of look at. But when we're looking at someone like a JSN, we're looking at someone even like a Kyle Pitts, who's now a post-hype guy. And I think that people can roll their eyes and be like, well, I mean, one of the things that could happen with Kyle Pitts is that you're just wrong and everything falls away. But Ben and I have done a show on it as well, where I mentioned, I mean, Kyle Pitts' volume numbers within the context of what they did last year were extraordinary. You look at that within the context then of the 2021 and the 2020 seasons for him, you get him at this price, it's the right bet to make. And we want to continually stack our teams with the right bet as we go forward. I guess, Colm, as I do this little soliloquy here, the thing that you probably take away from it is that as fired up about this team as you are, I'm in the same boat. I love what we were able to do here. I probably would have really liked to have gotten Geno or Jared Goff for this team, but Kyler almost makes it even a little bit more exciting because of what he could also bring to the table late. This was a very fun one to do.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And there is things in it, you know, if you look through the draft in general, there was players that maybe we wanted a little bit earlier in the draft. But then, as you know, I mentioned the Wilson pick in the second round, but as the draft played out, then it gave us the option to get to give us the option to pair up some of those game stacks. And then you mentioned the Kyler pick. That also allowed us access to Trey McBride. We'd probably go for one of the wide receivers at that point if we didn't get Kyler there, but it also means that we have a stack from that game. So I think looking through the draft board as you were discussing it, there's not a lot I would change in hindsight. There was picks I wanted at that moment in time, but I think the draft gods may have been kind to us on this one, and we had a lot of options at a lot of our picks. We weren't down to single particular options. We didn't have blank queues. So a lot of fun doing this draft. Hopefully people have enjoyed listening along. If you're listening to this point, thank you very much for sticking with us. Shawn mentioned his contest that he's running at the start of today's show. Drop us a written review on your favorite podcast app. We would appreciate that greatly. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast as well. I know a lot of people who are listening, and I'm sure they are subscribed. They're not going and looking each and every time individually, but you can subscribe, and also subscribe to the RotoViz Radio main feed. That also helps us out a lot. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work on rotoviz.com. And until we are back on Wednesday, have a good one.